The rain had a way of making the stone courtyard smell like old coins and wet moss, and that smell always meant carriages. Always meant standing very still, with my hands folded, while men more important than I would ever be stepped past me as though I were a piece of the architecture. I had been a maid in the Hallowmere estate for 6 years, since I was 17, and in that time I had perfected the art of being unseen. It is not difficult. Being invisible. You simply stop expecting anyone to look. That morning, the household had been turned inside out with preparation. Lord Hallomere's steward had run through the halls twice, shouting about silver polish and fresh linens, and Mrs. Aldridge, who managed us girls with the precision of a general, had pulled me aside before dawn. "You'll work the south entrance today, Elsie," she said, not meeting my eyes, already moving to the next crisis. "The Alpha King's carriage will arrive before noon. You open doors. You say nothing. You look at no one. Do you understand?" I understood. I always understood. 6 years of understanding had worn smooth grooves into me. Like a path through grass walked so many times the green never grows back. I had heard of King Theron the way one hears of weather in a distant country. Real, but unrelated to my life. They said the wolves of his bloodline could level a hillside with their fury. They said he had not smiled, truly smiled, since his coronation 3 years prior, when grief had hollowed something out of him that no one had ever managed to fill back in. They said many things. Servants always say many things because we are the only ones who see what nobles think no one is watching. By the time the carriages began rolling through the gates, the rain had softened into a fine mist that clung to my hair and made the cobblestones gleam like the scales of some great dark fish. I stood at my post beside the south entrance, spine straight, eyes lowered the way I had been trained, and listened to the approach of hooves and wheels with a kind of dull dread that had become so familiar it barely registered as fear anymore. The first carriage held lesser nobles. I recognized the Ashworth crest, a family known for their cruelty to servants who moved too slowly or smiled too widely. The second carried the king's personal guard, broad-shouldered men whose eyes swept the courtyard like they were already counting threats. The third carriage was black lacquered wood trimmed in silver, and it moved differently than the others, slower, heavier, as though even the horses understood the weight of what they pulled. My task was simple. Step forward, open the door, step back, say nothing. I had done this 100 times for 100 different nobles who never once looked down to see the woman holding the door, only forward, into whatever grand room awaited them. I expected nothing different now. I stepped forward. My fingers found the cold brass handle, slick with rain. I pulled the door open and held it, eyes fixed on the middle distance, the way Mrs. Aldridge had taught me, the way that made me disappear most efficiently. A boot touched the stone first. Then a hand, broad, scarred faintly across the knuckles, braced against the doorframe just above my own fingers. And then he was simply there, filling the space in front of me in a way that made the courtyard feel suddenly smaller, the rain suddenly louder. I do not know what made me look up. Perhaps it was instinct, the same animal instinct that makes a rabbit freeze when a shadow crosses overhead. Perhaps it was simply that he had not moved past me the way the others did, had paused, just slightly, just long enough that the pause itself became strange. King Theron was not smiling. They had been right about that. His face was carved from the same stillness as the stone beneath my feet. Dark eyes set beneath a brow drawn tight with something that looked less like anger and more like exhaustion, worn so long it had calcified into his bones. He was younger than I expected, though the weight he carried made him seem ancient. And for one suspended moment, those eyes were not looking past me. They were looking at me. My breath caught somewhere behind my ribs. I had spent 6 years training myself not to be seen. And here, in the space of a single held breath, all that training collapsed like a poorly built wall. "Your name." His voice was low, rough at the edges, like something that had not been used gently in a long while. I should not have answered. Maids did not answer kings directly. We answered through stewards, through layers of permission that kept us safely beneath notice. But the question hung there, and his eyes did not release me, and something in my chest, foolish, reckless, answered before my training could stop it. "Elsie, Your Majesty?" A flicker crossed his face. Not quite a smile. Something quieter. Recognition, perhaps, or surprise that I had spoken at all. "Elsie." He said it like he was testing the shape of it in his mouth. Then, before I could understand what was happening, before Mrs. Aldridge's training could rise up and pull my eyes back to the stones where they belonged, he leaned in, not close enough to be improper, but close enough that no one else might hear, close enough that the rain seemed to hush around us, and murmured 4 words that I would carry in my chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples I would feel for days. "Someone is waiting beyond the bridge." Then he straightened, and the moment broke as quickly as it had formed. He walked past me into the estate without another glance, his guards falling into step behind him, and I was left standing with my hand still on the carriage door, rain gathering in my open palm, my heart slamming against my ribs like something trying to escape. I closed the door. My fingers were not quite steady. What bridge? Who's waiting? The words made no sense, and yet they sat in my mind with the weight of something deliberate, something that had been chosen and placed there specifically for me, the invisible girl who held the door. Mrs. Aldridge appeared at my elbow moments later, her face pinched with the particular irritation of someone who had seen the king pause and could not begin to guess why. "What did he say to you?" "Nothing," I lied, the word coming easier than I expected. "He only asked my name." She studied me a moment longer, suspicion sharpening her gaze, and then the chaos of the household swept her away toward some new crisis, leaving me alone in the mist with rain in my palm and a king's voice still echoing in my ears. I went about my duties that day as I always did, polishing, carrying, disappearing into corners when nobles passed. But my mind kept circling back to that bridge. There was an old stone bridge at the eastern edge of the estate grounds, half forgotten, rarely used since the new road had been built decades before. I had crossed it only twice in 6 years, both times on errands no one else wanted. Why would the Alpha King know of it? Why would he speak of it to me, a servant whose entire purpose was to remain unnoticed? By evening, the rain had thickened again, drumming steadily against the windows as I made my way through the servants' corridor toward the kitchens, arms full of linens that needed washing before morning. The corridor was narrow and dim, lit only by a few guttering candles, and I nearly didn't notice the figure standing at the far end until I was almost upon him. One of the king's guards, tall, silent, his eyes finding mine in the candlelight, with an intensity that made the linens nearly slip from my arms. "You're Elsie," he said. Not a question. My pulse quickened, that same foolish ripple from the courtyard returning tenfold. "Yes." He did not explain himself, did not offer pleasantries. He simply studied me for a long moment, as though confirming something he had been told, and then said, low and quick, "Go to the bridge tonight, alone, before the moon clears the tower." And before I could ask a single question, before I could even draw the breath needed to speak, he turned and disappeared back down the corridor, leaving me standing alone with rain hammering the windows and my heart pounding louder than the storm itself. I stood in the corridor long after the guard's footsteps had faded, the linens growing heavy and damp in my arms, my mind a storm of its own. 6 years of careful invisibility had taught me one thing above all else. Servants who drew attention to themselves did not stay servants for long. They became cautionary tales, whispered about over breakfast preparation, names that disappeared from the household roster without explanation. And yet, go to the bridge tonight, alone. I told myself I would not go. I told myself this as I delivered the linens to the laundry room, as I helped Greta scrub the last of the supper pots, as I climbed the narrow servants' stairs to the small room I shared with 2 other maids. I told myself this, even as I lay on my thin mattress listening to Petra and Susan's breathing even out into sleep, even as I watched moonlight crawl slowly across the ceiling, climbing toward the tower the guard had mentioned. But some part of me, the same reckless part that had answered the king's question in the courtyard, had already decided. By the time the moon cleared the tower's edge, casting its silver light through our small window, I was already pulling my cloak from its hook, already easing the door open with the careful silence of someone who had spent years learning which floorboards betrayed movement and which stayed quiet. The estate grounds at night were a different country entirely. The careful order of daylight, the manicured hedges, the raked gravel paths, the watchful eyes of stewards, dissolved into something wilder, shadows pooling beneath ancient oaks, the distant call of an owl marking territory I had no business entering. I kept to the edges of the path, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs, every snapping twig sending ice through my veins. The bridge appeared first as a darker shape against the dark, a humped silhouette of old stone arching over the narrow river that marked the estate's eastern boundary. I had not been here since early spring, sent to retrieve a basket some careless noble had left behind during a picnic. It seemed different now, transformed by moonlight and my own thundering fear into something almost sacred, like a threshold between 2 worlds. I did not see him at first. He stood in the shadow of the bridge's far arch, still as the stone itself, and it was only when he shifted, a small movement, the soft creak of leather, that I realized I was not alone. "You came." King Theron's voice carried easily across the short distance, low and rough as it had been in the courtyard, but something in it had loosened, some careful control relaxed just slightly. "I shouldn't have," I admitted, because it was true, because some honesty in me refused to pretend otherwise even now, standing before a king in the dead of night like a fool. "Your Majesty, if anyone learns, no one will learn." He moved closer, and in the moonlight I could see him properly for the first time without the weight of courtly formality pressing down on us both. He wore no crown here, no heavy ceremonial cloak, just a simple dark coat that made him look almost ordinary, almost like a man rather than a legend wrapped in fur and fury. "I made certain of that before I sent Reyes to find you. Why?" The question left me before I could stop it, sharper than I intended. "Why send for me at all? I am no one. A maid who opens doors." Something flickered across his face, that same quiet recognition from the courtyard. "You are not no one." He said it simply, without flourish, as though stating a fact as plain as the moon overhead. "I watched you in that courtyard today. Every other servant kept their eyes fixed on the ground, their bodies arranged like furniture waiting to be useful. You looked up. For half a second, before your training caught you, you looked at me like I was a person, rather than a title. I felt heat rise in my cheeks despite the cold night air. That was a mistake. Mrs. Aldridge would have my position if she knew. Mrs. Aldridge answers to Lord Hallamere, who answers, in matters that concern me, to my word. There was no arrogance in how he said it, only weariness, the tired acknowledgement of a power he had never asked for and could not set down. "I am not here to discuss your employment, Elsie." "Then why are you here?" He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that I heard the river moving beneath the bridge, the soft rush of water over stone, the night settling around us like a held breath. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped lower still, rougher, as though the words cost him something to release. 3 years ago, I lost my sister. The admission came without warning, without preamble, and I understood instantly that this was not something he spoke of easily, perhaps not something he spoke of at all. "Mira," She was the only person in this world who looked at me the way you did today. Without fear, without calculation, without seeing the crown before she saw the man wearing it. When she died, I thought I had lost the last person who would ever look at me that way. The grief in his voice was raw, despite its restraint, and I felt something in my chest twist, with an ache that had nothing to do with my own circumstances, and everything to do with the way pain recognizes pain, even across the vast gulf between king and maid. "I'm sorry," I said, because it was true, because the words needed saying even if they could not fix anything. Grief like that doesn't simply end. No. He looked at me then, really looked, and I felt the weight of his attention like sunlight after a long winter, unfamiliar, almost too much to bear. It doesn't end. But today, for the first time in 3 years, something in my chest didn't feel quite so hollow. And I needed to know if that was real, or if I had simply imagined it because I wanted so badly for it to be true. I did not know what to say to that. No one had ever spoken to me with such unguarded honesty. Certainly no one of his standing, and the rawness of it left me feeling exposed in a way I had not anticipated when I crept from my bed an hour before. "I don't know what you want from me," I admitted finally. "I am a maid, Your Majesty. I have no dowry, no family name worth mentioning, nothing that could matter to a king. I am not asking what you can offer me." His voice carried a quiet intensity that made my breath catch. "I am asking if you would walk with me. Nothing more. Tonight, and perhaps if you are willing, other nights as well. No promises, no expectations beyond a few stolen hours where I am not a king, and you are not a maid. Only two people who happen to look at each other and see something worth seeing. The rational part of me, the part trained by 6 years of careful survival, screamed that this was reckless beyond measure. The kings did not walk with maids without consequence, that whatever this was could only end in heartbreak or ruin. But standing there in the moonlight, with the river singing beneath us, and his eyes holding mine without a trace of the cold authority I had expected from a king, I found that rational part growing quieter with every passing second. "Just walking," I said, testing the shape of the agreement. "Just walking." A ghost of something that might have been a smile touched the corner of his mouth. Not quite the full expression, but closer than anything the rumors had suggested he was capable of. We walked. Along the riverbank, beneath ancient willows whose branches trailed in the dark water, through a small grove where the air smelled of wet earth and growing things. He asked about my life with a curiosity that felt genuine rather than performed. Where I had grown up, how I had come to Hallowmere, what I dreamed of when the work was done and the candles burned low. I told him more than I intended. About my mother's death when I was 12, about the years in an orphanage before Mrs. Aldridge had taken pity and offered me a position, about the small private joy I took in tending the kitchen herb garden, the only piece of beauty I had any claim to in this life. He listened the way few people ever had, fully, without interruption, without the distracted half-attention nobles gave servants when duty required acknowledgement. And in turn, slowly, carefully, he told me pieces of himself I suspected few others ever saw. The crushing weight of a crown he had inherited too young. The constant calculation required of every word and gesture. The loneliness of a position that surrounded him with people while leaving him utterly, achingly alone. "Your council will not be pleased to hear you've been walking with a maid," I said as we made our way back toward the bridge, the eastern sky beginning to lighten almost imperceptibly at its edges. "My council is rarely pleased with anything that isn't strategically advantageous." There was dry humor in his voice now, something I hadn't expected from the stern figure who had stepped from that carriage. "They would prefer I marry some daughter of a wealthy house, secure an alliance, produce heirs with appropriately noble blood. They have not asked even once whether such a marriage would make me happy. And would it? I don't know anymore." He stopped walking, turning to face me fully in the gray light of approaching dawn. I had stopped believing happiness was something available to me. Today you reminded me that perhaps I was wrong. We stood there, close enough now that I could see the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the small scar above his left brow that no portrait had ever captured. Neither of us moved to close the remaining distance between us, though something in the air had shifted, grown taut with possibility. I should return before I'm missed, I said finally, the practical part of me reasserting itself even as everything else in me wanted to stay exactly where I stood. Yes. He did not argue, though I saw reluctance flicker across his face. Will you come again? Tomorrow night, if you're willing? I should have said no. Every instinct trained into me over 6 years of careful service screamed that this path led nowhere good, that kings and maids did not walk together beneath willow trees without someone, somewhere, eventually paying a terrible price for it. But standing there in the brightening dawn, with the memory of his unguarded honesty still warm in my chest, I found myself nodding before I had fully decided to. Tomorrow night, I agreed. He reached out then, briefly, and brushed his fingers against mine. The smallest touch. Barely more than the suggestion of contact, but it sent warmth flooding through me regardless. Thank you, Elsie, for coming, for listening. Thank you for seeing me, I said, and meant it more deeply than I had words to express. I made my way back to the servants' quarters as the sky turned from gray to pale gold, slipping through the same door I had eased open hours before, sliding into bed just as Petra began to stir. Sleep did not come easily. My mind too full of moonlight and rivers and a king's voice speaking grief and hope in the same trembling breath. The following days passed in a strange double rhythm. The familiar drudgery of my duties stretched thin over the secret current running beneath everything. The anticipation of evening building in me like water rising behind a dam. I polished silver and folded linens, and curtsied to nobles who never once looked at me, all while carrying inside myself a secret so vast it felt impossible that no one could see it written across my face. Mrs. Aldridge noticed something different in me, I think, though she could not have guessed the cause. You're distracted, girl, she snapped on the third day, when I nearly dropped a tray of porcelain teacups. Whatever's gotten into you, leave it at the door. We've guests of importance staying through the season, and I'll not have carelessness costing this house its reputation. Yes, Mrs. Aldridge, I murmured, gathering myself, though my heart still beat with the rhythm of footsteps along moonlit riverbanks. Each night, I slipped away to meet him at the bridge, and each night, the walls between king and maid grew thinner, worn down by honesty and shared silence, and the particular intimacy of two lonely people who had found, unexpectedly, a place where they did not have to perform for anyone but each other. He told me of his sister Mira more fully. Her laugh, her stubbornness, the way she used to sneak into the kitchens as a child to steal sweets before supper. I told him of nights in the orphanage, huddled with other forgotten children, inventing stories of better futures to keep the cold and fear at bay. It was on the 7th night, beneath the same willow where we had first truly spoken, that he turned to me with something different in his expression. Not the careful vulnerability of our earlier conversations, but something steadier, more resolved. There is a matter approaching that I must tell you of, he said, his voice carrying a gravity that made the warmth of the evening suddenly feel colder. My council has arranged a gathering, a ball in 3 weeks' time, meant to introduce potential matches for marriage. Daughters of noble houses, foreign dignitaries' kin. They believe it past time I secure my succession. My stomach dropped, though I tried to keep my expression even. I see. I do not wish to attend it, he continued quickly, reaching for my hand in the darkness, his fingers warm and certain around mine. But I cannot refuse outright without consequence to the kingdom's stability. There are alliances at stake, tensions with the northern pacts that a marriage might ease, I am bound by obligations larger than my own wishes." "Then you should attend," I said, though the words felt like swallowing stones. "Your duty matters more than—" "Don't." His grip tightened slightly, urgent. "Don't tell me my duty matters more than what I feel for you. I have spent my entire life being told what matters more than what I feel. I am asking you, Elsie, not to release me from anything, but simply to trust that whatever happens at that ball, what exists between us here, in these stolen hours, is not something I intend to surrender easily." I looked at him. Really looked. The way I had in that first moment in the courtyard, and saw not a king burdened by crown and counsel, but a man asking, with whatever courage he had left, for someone to believe in him a little longer. "I trust you," I whispered, though some small, frightened part of me wondered if trust alone would be enough to survive what was coming. The 3 weeks before the ball passed like a held breath, each day thinner and more fragile than the last. The estate buzzed with preparation, seamstresses arriving from the capital with bolts of silk that cost more than I would earn in a decade, musicians rehearsing in the East Hall until the walls themselves seemed to hum with anticipation, kitchens working through the night to prepare delicacies for nobility I would never be permitted to address directly. I continued my duties as though nothing had changed, though everything had. Each night, Theron and I still met at the bridge, our stolen hours growing more precious as the date of the ball drew nearer, each conversation carrying an unspoken weight neither of us dared name aloud. He told me of the house's sending daughters, Lady Caris of the Western Shores, known for her sharp political mind, the twin daughters of Lord Voss, whose family controlled trade routes vital to the kingdom's grain supply, a foreign princess from across the strait whose marriage would secure peace with a kingdom that had warred with ours twice in living memory. "They are not unkind women," he said one night, frustration coloring his voice. "I do not resent them for existing, for being offered as solutions to problems larger than any of us. But I cannot pretend my heart has room for calculation when it is already so thoroughly occupied." I said little in response to these confessions, uncertain what comfort I could offer a king facing the machinery of an entire kingdom's expectations. Instead, I listened, the way he had taught me he valued being listened to, and let my presence be whatever small anchor it could. On the 10th night, everything changed. I had arrived at the bridge later than usual, delayed by a broken vase that required cleaning before Mrs. Aldridge's morning inspection, and found Theron pacing beneath the willow with an agitation I had not seen in him before. His guard Reyes stood a short distance away, his expression grim in the moonlight. "What's happened?" I asked, hurrying toward him. "Someone has seen us." Theron's voice was tight, controlled in the way that I had learned meant he was working hard to contain something larger underneath. "One of the kitchen staff, returning late from the village, claims to have witnessed us walking together 3 nights past. The rumor has already reached my council." Cold dread pooled in my stomach. What will happen? Nothing, if I have any say in it. His jaw tightened. But my council is not without influence, and there are those among them who would see any complication to the marriage negotiations as a threat worth eliminating. They have already begun making inquiries about you, Elsie, your position, your family, your history at Hallowmere. "They could have me dismissed," I said, the practical horror of it settling over me. "Or worse. I will not allow that." His hand found mine, gripping tightly enough that I felt the tremor of barely restrained fury beneath his calm exterior. "But I need you to understand the danger more clearly than perhaps I have allowed myself to acknowledge. There are factions within my own court who have lost much to instability, who remember the wars before my father's reign, who believe any deviation from careful alliance-building risks plunging us back into that chaos. They will not see a kitchen maid as a romantic complication. They will see her as a threat to the kingdom's security. I thought of the orphanage, of the careful, hard-won safety I had built for myself at Hallowmere through 6 years of perfect invisibility. I thought of how quickly that safety could be stripped away by powerful people who had never once had to fight for anything they possessed. Perhaps we should stop, I heard myself say, though the words tasted like ash. Before it goes further. Before I become something that costs you the kingdom's stability. No. The word came sharp, immediate, his eyes finding mine with an intensity that stole my breath. I have spent 3 years believing happiness was a country I could no longer enter. I will not surrender it now because cowards in my council fear a maid's compassion more than they fear my unhappiness. Let them make their inquiries. Let them whisper their concerns. I am the king, Elsie, and I have not yet decided to be ruled by fear disguised as caution. Reyes cleared his throat from his post nearby. Your Majesty, perhaps a measure of discretion, at least until... I know, Reyes. Theron's voice softened slightly, though the resolve beneath it remained unshaken. We will be more careful, but I will not stop seeing her. That night, as I made my way back to the servants' quarters in the gray hour before dawn, I felt the first true tendrils of fear curl through what had, until now, been a fragile and beautiful secret. It was one thing to risk my own position, my own safety, in pursuit of something that made me feel, for the first time in years, truly seen. It was another to consider that my presence might genuinely threaten the stability Theron had spent his entire reign trying to protect. The following days brought subtle changes I might not have noticed before, Mrs. Aldridge watching me with new scrutiny, questions about my whereabouts during off hours, phrased with careful casualness, that nonetheless carried an edge of suspicion. One afternoon, I found a stranger in the kitchen garden where I tended the herbs, a woman in fine traveling clothes who introduced herself only as Lady Voss's companion, asking idle questions about the household staff that felt anything but idle. You've been here long, I understand, the woman said, her smile pleasant, but her eyes sharp as a hawk's. 6 years, is it? Strange that someone with so little family connection has stayed so long in a single position. Most girls in your circumstance move on to better prospects, or marriage, or somewhere with more. Opportunity. I am content here, my lady, I said carefully, keeping my eyes lowered, my voice steady despite the hammering of my heart. Content. She turned the word over as though testing it for hidden meaning. How fortunate to find contentment in such limited circumstances. Though I imagine some might find other reasons to remain in a household where opportunities for advancement might present themselves unexpectedly. I said nothing, understanding the threat embedded in her pleasant tone, the warning wrapped in courtly pleasantries. She left without further comment, but the message had been delivered clearly enough. Someone, somewhere in the noble houses competing for the king's hand, had begun to suspect that something stood between their ambitions and success. I did not tell Theron of the encounter that night, not wanting to add weight to burdens he already carried, though I suspect he read the tension in my face regardless. He held my hand longer than usual as we walked, his thumb tracing slow circles against my palm, as though trying to soothe fears he could sense but could not name. The ball is in 4 days, he said quietly, as the night drew toward its close. I need you to know that whatever happens there, whatever performance I am required to give for the sake of political theater, it changes nothing of what exists between us here. I understand obligation, I said, and I did, perhaps better than most, having spent my entire life bound by the obligations others placed upon me without consultation or choice. I don't think you fully understand what I'm trying to say. He stopped walking, turning to face me with an urgency that made my breath catch. I am not asking you to simply tolerate whatever spectacle the ball requires. I am telling you that no matter how many daughters of noble houses I am paraded before, no matter what alliances my council attempts to forge through marriage, I have already chosen. I chose the moment you looked up at me in that courtyard, instead of keeping your eyes properly lowered. I have been choosing every night since, in every conversation, every silence we've shared beneath this tree. The weight of his words settled over me like warmth after long cold, and yet beneath the warmth, fear still coiled tight in my chest. Kings do not marry maids, Theron. Even kings who wish otherwise. Kings do many things their councils believe impossible, when the alternative is a lifetime of hollow obligation. His hand cupped my cheek, gentle despite the fierce conviction in his eyes. Give me until after the ball. Trust me a little longer, Elsie. I am not without resources, without allies who value happiness as much as strategy. Let me find a way through this, and I promise you, whatever comes, I will not let fear or convenience steal this from us. I wanted desperately to believe him, wanted to trust the promise burning in his eyes with the same fierce hope that had carried me through every difficult year of my life. But experience had taught me that promises made beneath moonlight did not always survive contact with the harder light of day, and the ball, with all its political weight and noble ambition, loomed ahead like a storm I could not yet see the shape of. I'll trust you, I said finally, because the alternative, walking away from this fragile, impossible happiness before I had to, felt like a wound I could not survive inflicting upon myself. But Theron, please, be careful. There are people who would see me removed from this equation entirely, and I do not think they would hesitate to act if the opportunity presented itself. His expression darkened, something protective and fierce moving behind his eyes. I will not let anything happen to you. Whatever else fails, know that I will not let that happen. We parted as dawn began creeping over the eastern hills, his promise echoing in my chest alongside a fear I could not quite shake. As I made my way back through the gray morning light, I noticed a figure watching from an upper window of the estate. There and then gone, too quick to identify, but enough to send fresh ice through my veins. Someone was watching. Someone had been watching, perhaps for longer than I wanted to consider. The ball was 4 days away, and I understood, with sudden and terrible clarity, that whatever happened there would not simply determine the shape of Theron's political future. It would determine whether I survived to see another season at all. The day of the ball arrived wrapped in a tension so thick I could taste it in the air, sharp as iron. The estate had transformed overnight into something I barely recognized. Every surface gleaming, every hallway draped in silk banners bearing the royal crest. The great hall converted into a glittering cavern of candlelight and music that would soon host every noble house with ambitions toward the crown. I was assigned, along with several other maids, to the kitchens and the service corridors that ran behind the great hall, close enough to hear the swell of orchestral music, but far enough that I would never glimpse the spectacle itself. It was, I told myself, exactly as it should be. I had no place among silk gowns and noble introductions. My place was here, among trays of delicacies and the controlled chaos of a household stretched to its limits. And yet I could not stop my mind from conjuring images of Theron standing in that glittering hall, being introduced to daughter after daughter of houses far more suitable than mine, his face arranged into whatever careful diplomatic mask his position required. The evening wore on in a blur of carried trays and shouted instructions, the music drifting through the service doors in fragments, a waltz, then another, the murmur of hundreds of voices rising and falling like tide against rock. I caught glimpses through the swinging doors when I delivered trays to the hall's edge, candlelight glinting off jewels I could never afford, gowns in colors I had only seen in dreams. And once, briefly, the king himself, tall and composed at the center of it all, his expression carefully neutral as a young woman in deep blue silk curtsied before him. I turned away before I could see more, my chest tight with something I refused to name as jealousy, though it tasted exactly like that bitter thing. It was nearing midnight when the trouble began. I had been sent to retrieve additional wine from the cellar, navigating the narrow service stairs with a candle in one hand, when I heard raised voices echoing from somewhere above, not the polite murmur of ballroom conversation, but something sharper, more urgent. I paused at the base of the stairs, uncertain whether to proceed, when Reyes appeared at the top, his face grim in the candlelight. Elsie. He said my name like a warning. You need to leave, now, through the kitchen entrance, away from the main house. What's happened? Fear spiked through me, cold and immediate. Lady Voss's companion has accused you, has told the council that the king has been engaging in an inappropriate liaison with a servant. They've sent men to find you. His eyes were urgent, scanning the shadows behind me. Some of the council believe removing you quietly would resolve their concerns about the alliance negotiations. I don't know how far they're willing to go to ensure that resolution. The candle trembled in my hand. Theron, does he know? He's trying to manage the situation in the hall, but he can't leave without drawing more attention to exactly what they're trying to expose. Elsie, please, you need to go. Now. I should have run. Every survival instinct I had cultivated over 6 years screamed at me to flee, to disappear into the night, and put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever danger was closing in. But some stubborn, foolish part of me, the same part that had looked up in that courtyard instead of keeping my eyes lowered, refused to simply vanish without understanding what was happening, without at least attempting to face whatever came, rather than hiding from it. I won't run, I said, surprising myself with the steadiness of my own voice. If they want to find me, let them find me standing rather than cowering in some hedge a mile from here. I won't give them the satisfaction of believing I'm something to be ashamed of. Reyes stared at me for a long moment, something like respect flickering across his stern features. Then come with me. If you must be found, better it happens where I can ensure you're not harmed in the process. He led me not toward the kitchens, but toward a small antechamber adjacent to the great hall, separated from the main spectacle by a heavy curtain that muffled most of the music and conversation beyond. We had barely settled there when the curtain was thrown back, revealing 3 figures: Lady Voss's sharp-eyed companion, a stern older man I recognized as a senior council member, and behind them, moving with controlled urgency, King Theron himself. There, the companion said, her voice carrying a note of triumph that made my skin crawl. The maid in question. I told you my suspicions were not unfounded. The council member's expression was cold, assessing. Your Majesty, this is precisely the kind of complication we feared. A servant, entangled with the crown on the very night, meant to secure vital alliances. The northern delegation has already begun asking pointed questions about rumors reaching their ears. There is no entanglement requiring your concern, Theron said, his voice carrying the kind of measured authority I had not heard him use before. Every inch the king his subjects believed him to be. Elsie is a member of this household's staff. Nothing more. Forgive me, Your Majesty, but witnesses have seen you walking together at night, on multiple occasions, in circumstances that suggest considerably more than passing acquaintance. The council member's eyes flicked toward me with something between disdain and calculation. The girl's presence here, on this night of all nights, only confirms what we feared. I felt the weight of every eye in that small antechamber settle upon me, and for one terrible moment, the old instinct to disappear, to make myself small and unremarkable, rose up with crushing familiarity. 6 years of training screamed at me to lower my eyes, to apologize, to accept whatever judgment these powerful people chose to render. But I thought of Theron's words beneath the willow tree. You looked at me like I was a person rather than a title. And I thought of every night I had spent listening to his grief, sharing my own, building something real in the space between 2 lonely people who had simply chosen to see each other clearly. I would not disappear now. I will not deny that the king and I have spoken, I said, my voice trembling but holding steady enough to carry through the small room. I will not deny that those conversations meant something to me, more than I perhaps had any right to expect given my position, but I have never asked for anything beyond his honesty, never sought advantage or position through whatever connection exists between us. If my presence here threatens alliances that matter to this kingdom's stability, I will remove myself from it. I will not, however, apologize for the simple act of having been seen by someone who chose to look. Silence fell over the antechamber, broken only by the distant strains of orchestral music drifting from the hall beyond. The council member's expression flickered with something I could not quite identify. Surprise, perhaps, at finding more steel in a maid than he had expected. Theron stepped closer, positioning himself slightly in front of me, though not so much that it appeared he was hiding me away. Elsie will not be removing herself from anything. I have made my position clear, and I will not be swayed by fear, masquerading as political necessity. If the Northern delegation requires reassurance, I will provide it through diplomacy, not through sacrificing the one genuine connection I have found since my sister's death. Your Majesty, with respect, the kingdom's stability cannot rest on sentiment alone. The kingdom's stability has rested on far worse foundations than sentiment, Lord Ashby, and you know this as well as I do. Theron's voice carried an edge now, sharp enough that the council member visibly recalibrated his approach. I have given this kingdom 3 years of careful, joyless duty. I have made every decision my council required, sacrificed every personal desire for the sake of political expedience. I am asking, for the first time, to be permitted a measure of happiness that does not compromise this kingdom's security. If you cannot grant me that much trust after 3 years of proven loyalty, then perhaps the conversation we need to have extends beyond this single matter. The threat, carefully wrapped in diplomatic language, was unmistakable. Lord Ashby's expression tightened, calculation visible behind his eyes as he weighed the risk of pressing further against a king who had just demonstrated he would not be easily cowed. I will need to discuss this with the rest of the council, he said finally, his voice stiff with barely concealed displeasure. This is not a matter that resolves itself in a single evening's confrontation. Discuss what you must, Theron replied. But know that my decision regarding Elsie's place in my life is not subject to council approval. I will manage whatever diplomatic concerns arise from tonight's gathering through whatever means prove necessary, but I will not sacrifice her for the sake of easing your discomfort. Lord Ashby departed with stiff formality, the companion trailing behind him with a final, venomous glance in my direction that promised this confrontation was far from finished. Reyes moved to follow, ensuring their departure, leaving Theron and me alone in the small antechamber, the muffled music of the ball continuing obliviously beyond the curtain. I'm sorry, Theron said immediately, his composed mask finally cracking to reveal the raw concern beneath. I should have anticipated this more carefully, should have protected you better from— You didn't lie for me, I interrupted, something fierce and warm blooming in my chest despite the fear still coursing through me. You could have denied everything, claimed I meant nothing, and the entire situation would have resolved far more easily. Instead, you stood there and told the truth, knowing exactly what it might cost you. Because it is the truth. He reached for my hands, holding them with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the authority he had just displayed. I told you I had already chosen Elsie. I meant it. Whatever comes from tonight's confrontation, whatever battles I must fight with my council in the days ahead, I do not regret a single moment of what exists between us. I should have felt only fear in that moment, surrounded by political machinery far larger and more dangerous than anything I had ever navigated before. But standing there, hands held in his, I felt something else entirely. A fragile, stubborn hope that perhaps, against every reasonable expectation, this impossible thing between us might actually survive the storm now building around it. What happens now? I asked. Now, he said, I finish what this evening requires of me, and tomorrow, I begin the work of ensuring my council understands that this is not a battle they can win through intimidation. But Elsie, his grip on my hands tightened slightly. I need you to be careful. Lady Voss and those who share her ambitions will not simply accept tonight's outcome quietly. They may attempt other means to remove the complication you represent to their plans. The warning settled cold and heavy in my chest, a reminder that whatever fragile victory we had won tonight, the war itself remained far from over. 3 days passed after the ball, in a tense quiet that felt more dangerous than open conflict. The household buzzed with rumors I was not meant to hear. Whispers of council meetings stretching late into the night, of Lord Ashby's faction pressing hard against Theron's resolve, of the northern delegation departing earlier than scheduled, their diplomatic mission left unfinished. Mrs. Aldridge watched me now with an expression I could not quite read, somewhere between pity and wariness, as though she expected my dismissal at any moment and did not know how to prepare me for it. I continued my duties, though every task felt weighted with uncertainty. I had not seen Theron since the night of the ball. Reyes had sent word through careful, indirect means that the king's days were consumed entirely by council negotiations, that any meeting between us now would only add fuel to a fire his enemies were eager to feed. It was on the 4th night that Lady Voss's companion found me alone. I had gone to the kitchen garden after dark, seeking the small comfort of tending the herbs in solitude. When she emerged from the shadows near the garden wall with 2 men, I did not recognize standing silent behind her. "You should have left when given the chance," she said, her earlier pleasantness entirely abandoned now, replaced by something cold and purposeful. "The council has reached an impasse. Some of us believe a more permanent solution would serve everyone's interests far better than continued debate." Fear coiled tight in my stomach, but I forced my voice to remain steady. "What do you want?" "A confession." She produced a folded paper, ink already prepared. "That you seduced the king through deception, that you sought advantage through manipulation unbecoming a servant. Sign it. Leave Hallamere tonight with the compensation we've arranged, and this entire matter resolves itself quietly. Refuse, and I cannot guarantee what measures my associates might consider necessary to protect the kingdom's stability." The threat was unmistakable, and looking at the 2 silent men flanking her, I understood with sudden clarity that this conversation had moved beyond political maneuvering into something far more dangerous. "I won't sign lies," I said, though my heart hammered against my ribs. "Whatever you do to me, I won't give you a false confession to use against him." "Then you leave us no choice." What happened next unfolded with terrifying speed. One of the men stepping forward, reaching for my arm, the garden suddenly feeling impossibly far from the safety of the main house. I twisted away, opening my mouth to scream, when a third figure emerged from the darkness behind them, moving with the silent precision of someone trained for exactly this kind of confrontation. Reyes had them both subdued before the companion could even finish her startled gasp, his expression carrying a controlled fury I had not seen from him before. Lady Voss's companion, conspiring to abduct a member of the royal household against her will. I believe the council will find this development considerably more illuminating than any confession you hope to extract. "You followed me," I breathed, relief flooding through me so suddenly my knees nearly buckled. "The king insisted on a guard remaining near you at all times, even during the days he could not see you himself." Reyes secured the second man with practiced efficiency, his eyes never leaving the companion's furious face. It appears his caution was well warranted. What followed moved quickly once the truth came to light. The companion's testimony, extracted under the council's own formal questioning, revealed not only the attempted coercion, but evidence of a broader conspiracy. Lord Ashby and several allied council members had conspired not merely to remove me from the equation, but to manufacture a scandal that would force Theron into a politically advantageous marriage, regardless of his own wishes, securing their own influence through the alliance that would result. The revelation shattered whatever remaining support Lord Ashby's faction held within the council. Theron, presented with undeniable proof of his advisor's willingness to endanger an innocent woman for political gain, moved swiftly and decisively, removing Ashby and his co-conspirators from their positions entirely, their influence within the kingdom's governance dismantled in a single, decisive stroke. I learned of these developments only in fragments, secluded for my own safety in a guarded chamber within the estate, while the political machinery worked itself out beyond my sight. It was nearly a week before Theron came to me himself, finding me in the small garden where the attempted abduction had occurred, his expression carrying both exhaustion and something I had not seen in him before, a kind of unburdened relief, as though some great weight had finally lifted from his shoulders. "It's done," he said simply, settling beside me on the garden bench. "Ashby and those who conspired with him have been stripped of their positions. The council that remains understands clearly now that I will not be manipulated through threats against those I care for. I'm sorry you had to fight this battle because of me," I said, though gratitude and relief made the words feel inadequate. "You misunderstand." He took my hand, his thumb tracing slow patterns against my palm in the gesture I had come to know so well. "This was never a battle I fought because of you, Elsie. It was a battle I fought for myself, for the first time in 3 years, for the right to choose happiness over hollow obligation, for the right to value a person's character over the convenience of their birth. You did not create this conflict. You simply showed me I no longer had to accept a life without it." We sat together in comfortable silence for a long moment, the kitchen garden's familiar scents of rosemary and thyme settling around us like something sacred. "What happens now?" I asked finally, echoing the question I had asked beneath the willow tree weeks before, though everything about the circumstances had transformed entirely. "Now," he said, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw something close to genuine joy move across his features. "I would like to court you properly, Elsie, not in secret, not beneath cover of darkness at some forgotten bridge, but openly, with whatever ceremony and recognition my position requires. I have spent enough years hiding what I feel behind careful diplomatic masks. I do not intend to hide this." The proposal, when it came weeks later, surprised no one within the household who had watched our courtship unfold in the months following Ashby's removal. A courtship conducted, as Theron had promised, openly and without apology, evenings spent walking the estate gardens in full view of staff and council alike, dinners shared, conversations carried out without the desperate secrecy that had once defined every moment we spent together. I will not pretend the transition was without difficulty. There were nobles who never fully accepted a kitchen maid rising to such unprecedented position, whispers that followed me through palace corridors even after my marriage was formalized, judgmental glances from those who believed birth should determine worth more thoroughly than character ever could. But Theron stood beside me through each difficulty, and slowly, gradually, the household and the wider kingdom came to understand what he had recognized in that first moment in the courtyard, that the woman who had spent 6 years perfecting the art of being unseen had in fact always possessed exactly the qualities a kingdom needed in its queen: compassion forged through hardship, courage tempered by genuine humility, and an unshakable commitment to honesty even when silence would have proven easier. Mrs. Aldridge, of all people, became one of my staunchest allies in those early months, her gruff exterior finally revealing the genuine care she had always carried for the girls under her management, even when duty required her stern distance. "I always knew you carried more steel than most," she told me once, shortly before my wedding, her eyes suspiciously bright despite her characteristically brusque tone. "I simply never expected a king to recognize it before the rest of us did." The wedding itself was a quiet affair by royal standards, held in the same gardens where Theron had found me after the attempted abduction, surrounded by the herbs and growing things that had always brought me peace. I wore no elaborate jewels, no extravagant gown befitting typical royal ceremony, only a simple dress the color of morning mist, and in my hair, a small sprig of rosemary from the garden I had tended for 6 years as an invisible maid, now blooming into something else entirely. Reyes stood as Theron's witness, his stern face softening into something like genuine warmth as he watched the man he had protected for years finally find the happiness circumstance had so long denied him. And as the simple ceremony concluded, as Theron's hand found mine beneath the late afternoon sun, I thought of that first rainy morning in the courtyard, of a king who had paused just long enough to truly see the maid holding his carriage door, of 4 whispered words that had changed the entire shape of my life. Someone is waiting beyond the bridge. I understood now, standing in that garden as Theron's wife, that the bridge had never simply been a physical place of stone and moonlit water. It had been the threshold between the life I had resigned myself to accepting and the one I had never dared imagine possible, between invisibility and recognition, between surviving quietly and truly living. I had crossed that bridge not knowing what waited on the other side, carrying only fear and stubborn hope in equal measure. What I found there was not merely a king's affection, though that alone would have been more than I ever expected from a life defined by careful invisibility. I found, instead, a partnership built on mutual recognition. 2 people who had each spent years feeling unseen by the world around them, who had chosen, against every reasonable expectation, to see each other clearly and completely. The kingdom prospered in the years that followed, strengthened rather than weakened by a queen who understood, intimately, what it meant to struggle, to fear, to hope against impossible odds. I never forgot the lessons of those 6 years as a maid, the patience, the resilience, the quiet dignity required to survive a world that valued me only for my usefulness. I carried those lessons into my new position, ensuring that every servant within the palace walls received the recognition and respect I had once believed myself unworthy of receiving. And on quiet evenings, when the weight of court and crown grew heavy upon us both, Theron and I would still walk together beneath the willow tree by the old stone bridge. The same path we had once traveled in secret fear, now traveled freely in the golden light of a love that had survived every storm sent to extinguish it. The maid who had once closed a king's carriage door in careful, practiced silence had found, beyond that bridge, not merely a crown, but something far more precious, a place where she was finally, completely, unmistakably seen.